Some houses do not reject strangers with locked doors. They wait until midnight and teach them fear. Charlotte Bennet arrived at Ravenhurst Hall beneath a sky torn by rain, her traveling cloak dark with water and her single leather case pressed against one side. The great house rose above the black trees like a stone judgment, every window lit except those in the eastern wing, where 12 panes remained blind beneath drawn curtains. Before Charlotte reached the steps, the front door opened and a young maid rushed past her without a bonnet, clutching a ring of keys so tightly that they cut pale marks into her palm. "Do not stay," the girl whispered. She dropped the keys onto the wet stone and disappeared into the storm before anyone could stop her. Charlotte watched until the darkness swallowed her, then bent, gathered the keys, and climbed the remaining steps. Thomas Hale, the gray-haired butler, stood beneath the entrance lamps with exhaustion hidden behind perfect posture. "Miss Bennet," he said, "you have arrived at an unfortunate hour. I have known worse hours." He studied her rain-soaked dress, her modest case, and the calm expression she wore like armor. "I hope so." Inside, Ravenhurst smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and ashes left too long in cold fireplaces. Servants moved through the hall without speaking. A footman took Charlotte's cloak but would not meet her eyes. Somewhere above, a door closed sharply. Then Duke Alexander Reed appeared at the head of the staircase. He was tall, dark-haired, and dressed in black evening clothes, his face composed with the severity of a man who had stopped expecting good news years earlier. His gaze moved from Charlotte to the keys in her hand. "Another resignation?" he asked. Thomas inclined his head. "Miss Ellis departed without notice, Your Grace." Alexander descended slowly. "How long did she last?" 17 days. Longer than the previous one. He stopped before Charlotte. "And this is her replacement?" "Temporary assistant to the household office," Thomas replied. "Miss Charlotte Bennet." Alexander's attention rested on her plain gloves, worn case, and rain-pale face. "She will not survive this house." The words were spoken to Thomas, but not quietly enough to spare her. Several servants paused near the walls, waiting to see whether she would protest. Charlotte placed the abandoned keys on the marble table between them. "Then I should begin before the house notices I am afraid." For the first time, something shifted in Alexander's expression. Not warmth. Interest. Brief and unwilling. "You may find confidence less useful here than caution. Caution is useful only after one understands the danger." Thomas coughed softly, perhaps to hide approval. Alexander turned away. "Show her the west rooms. Keep her from the eastern corridor." "Of course, Your Grace." Charlotte followed the butler through halls lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress. Thomas explained the schedule, the household accounts, and the servants who no longer trusted one another. 3 keys were missing from the main ring. The steward, Edmund Clark, controlled the wage books. The kitchen answered to no one after sunset. "And the eastern corridor?" Charlotte asked. Thomas's steps slowed. "It has been closed for 12 years. "Why?" "Because His Grace ordered it." That answer ended the conversation. Near midnight, Charlotte sat alone in her narrow room, copying the next day's duty list by candlelight. Wind pressed against the glass. The old pipes murmured inside the walls. Then a servant bell rang above her door. Once, twice, 3 times. Charlotte looked at the numbered panel beside the fireplace. The small brass marker trembled beneath a single word, East Room. She took the candle and followed the dark corridor until she reached the locked wing. The bell rang again from beyond the sealed door. Thomas had said no one had entered that room in 12 years. Yet when Charlotte placed her hand against the wood, she heard something move on the other side. Charlotte kept her palm against the sealed door and listened. The sound came again, not footsteps, but a dull scrape followed by the faint trembling of metal inside the wall. She lifted the candle higher. The brass pull cord beside the frame moved slightly, though there was no wind in the corridor. "Miss Bennet." Thomas Hale's voice reached her from the darkness behind. She turned. The butler stood several yards away in his night robe beneath a heavy black coat, his expression more alarmed than angry. "You were told to avoid this wing." The bell rang 4 times. Old houses make old noises. Bells do not ring by memory. Thomas approached and pulled the cord housing open with a small key. Inside, the wire had loosened from its guide and rubbed against a corroded pipe whenever the storm shifted the wall. He showed her the mechanism without meeting her eyes. "There. Nothing more. Charlotte watched him secure it. Then why is this door locked? Because some rooms are easier to close than repair. He took the candle from her hand and led her back toward the servants' hall. By morning, Ravenhurst had already begun testing her. Her breakfast place had been omitted from the long table below stairs. The kitchen maid claimed there was no bread left, though Charlotte had seen 3 fresh loaves cooling near the oven. When she requested the west pantry key, the housekeeper gave her one that opened the linen closet instead. A footman delivered the wrong duty roster, sending 2 maids to the north gallery while the guest rooms went untouched. No insult was spoken directly. That would have been too simple. The household preferred small humiliations arranged so neatly that each could be dismissed as error. Charlotte said nothing. She poured herself tea from the servant's pot, took an apple from the storage basket, and began making notes. By noon, she knew the kitchen withheld food every Tuesday, though the accounts listed full portions. She knew coal deliveries were recorded at 20 sacks more than the seller received. She knew Edmund Clark paid the younger footmen less than the older men for identical work and told each group the other had demanded the difference. Fear did not govern Ravenhurst alone. Suspicion did. Edmund found her in the household office before supper, comparing wage ledgers against pantry invoices. He was broad, polished, and careful with his smile. "Those books are outside your duties, Miss Bennet." "Then my duties have been described poorly. You are here to assist Mr. Hale, not investigate the estate. I am counting bread and coal. At Ravenhurst, even bread and coal belong to the estate." His tone remained courteous, but his eyes did not. "You would be wise to remember who controls them." Charlotte closed the ledger. "That is precisely what I am trying to learn." Edmund's smile thinned. He left without another word. That evening, Alexander watched from the upper gallery as Charlotte reorganized the duty board below. Servants who had ignored one another all day now argued over missing shifts. Charlotte listened until every complaint contradicted the next, then replaced the old schedule with one written in her own hand. "You are causing unrest," Alexander said when she noticed him. "No, Your Grace. I am making it visible. You have been here less than a day. That has been sufficient." His gaze hardened, yet he did not order her to stop. Later, Thomas brought Charlotte the weekly wage book. She opened it beside the lamp and traced the secret payments written in a narrower column near the spine. Coal merchants, laundry suppliers, stable boys, and one repeated name. T. Hale. Charlotte stared at the initials while the servant bell above the fireplace began to tremble again. This time, it was not the Eastern room calling. It was the butler's private chamber. The bell above the fireplace trembled twice, then fell still. Charlotte closed the wage book and carried it through the silent corridor toward Thomas Hale's chamber. She found the butler standing beside his desk, one hand resting on the back of a chair as though the room had shifted beneath him. "You saw the initials," he said. It was not a question. Charlotte placed the ledger on the desk between them. "I saw payments recorded under your name, and you assume they belong to me. I assume nothing until the figures agree." Thomas looked older in the candlelight. "Then keep looking." Before Charlotte could answer, a deep crack sounded somewhere below, followed by a distant rush of water. A maid shouted from the lower hall. Within seconds, Ravenhurst awakened in confusion. A pipe had burst above the old nursery, sending freezing water through the ceiling and across the corridor toward the grain storage rooms below. Wind pressed snow against the windows while servants ran in opposite directions, each waiting for someone else to decide what mattered first. Edmund Clark appeared in the great hall wearing a heavy coat over his evening clothes. "Protect the west drawing rooms," he ordered. "The carpets there are imported." Charlotte stepped between him and the servants. "The water is moving toward the grain cellar." Edmund's expression sharpened. "The carpets are worth more. The grain feeds 40 tenant families. You have no authority here." Another section of plaster gave way above the nursery passage, scattering dust across the wet floor. Charlotte turned to the servants. "Mary, take the children from the tenant cottages into the great hall. James, close the main water valve. Mrs. Webb, bring every blanket from the unused guest rooms. Move the grain to the upper pantry before the lower corridor floods." No one moved at first. Then Thomas lifted his chin. "You heard Miss Bennet." The household sprang into motion. For the next 2 hours, Charlotte moved through Ravenhurst with soaked sleeves and a lantern in one hand. She organized lines of servants to carry sacks upstairs, ordered old curtains cut into strips to seal the draft beneath the great hall doors, and sent stable hands with wagons to collect children from cottages along the eastern road. She assigned the kitchen to prepare hot broth and counted every blanket as it was distributed. Edmund protested until Charlotte placed the damaged inventory ledger before him. If the grain is lost, the shortage will expose every false delivery entered this winter. He went silent. Duke Alexander was 20 miles north, inspecting a tenant farm where snow had blocked the road. He returned near dawn to find Ravenhurst transformed. The marble hall had become a refuge of mattresses, lamps, and sleeping children. Servants carried out Charlotte's instructions without hesitation. Thomas stood beside the duty board taking reports from department heads, but every answer was directed toward Charlotte. She stood near the staircase in a damp blue dress, hair loosening from its pins, one hand wrapped around a cup of untouched tea while she checked the final grain count. Alexander stopped beneath the archway. "Who authorized this?" he asked. The room quieted. Charlotte looked up. "No one. You took command of my household. Your household required command." His gaze moved over the sheltered families, the rescued supplies, and the servants waiting for her next decision. Something unreadable passed across his face. "And Mr. Clark?" "Unavailable when useful." Thomas concealed a cough. Alexander should have been offended. Instead, he looked almost startled by the order she had drawn from chaos. A little boy approached Charlotte and tugged at her sleeve. In his palm lay a tarnished signet ring set with a dark blue stone. "I found it inside the nursery wall," he said. Alexander crossed the hall before Charlotte could speak. His composure vanished when he saw the crest. "Where did you get that?" "Behind the broken plaster, Your Grace." Charlotte turned the ring beneath the candlelight. "It belonged to someone in your family." Alexander's voice lowered. "It belonged to my mother." The servants fell silent again. 12 years earlier, the late Duchess had died with the ring missing from her hand. Now it had emerged from the wall beside the flooded nursery, as though Ravenhurst had chosen this night to return what had been hidden. Alexander reached for it, but the ring did not leave Charlotte's palm. Around the crest, almost invisible beneath the tarnish, was a tiny, engraved key. Alexander took the ring from Charlotte's palm with a care that made the gesture seem almost ceremonial. For several seconds, he studied the tiny engraved key beneath the family crest, then turned toward the eastern corridor. "Come with me," he said. Thomas followed at a distance, but Edmund remained in the great hall, his face unreadable. The locked wing smelled of dust, cedar, and cold stone. Alexander opened the first iron gate with a key from his own chain, then stopped before the sealed door Charlotte had found on her first night. "My mother's private study," he said. "No one has entered since her death." "Then perhaps the ring was meant to make that impossible," Charlotte replied. The signet fit into a narrow slot hidden beneath the brass plate. A quiet click sounded inside the door. Alexander hesitated before pushing it open. Pale morning light entered through covered windows, revealing furniture draped in linen, shelves of untouched books, and a writing desk beneath the portrait of the late Duchess. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet the room did not feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. Charlotte moved toward the desk while Alexander remained near the threshold, every line of his body held rigid against memory. The ring opened a concealed drawer beneath the writing surface. Inside lay a black leather ledger, several sealed letters, and a folded page marked with the Duchess's hand. Charlotte read the first entries silently. Grain shipments paid twice. Coal invoices from companies that did not exist. Wages redirected through private accounts. The same names she had seen in Ravenhurst's current records appeared across pages written 12 years earlier. Edmund Clark was among them. "She knew," Charlotte said. Alexander stepped closer. "Knew what?" Charlotte handed him the page. At the bottom, one sentence had been underlined twice. "The man who controls the servants will one day control my son." Alexander's face changed, not with surprise, but with the pain of something long suspected and never faced. "My mother believed everyone was against her near the end," he said. "My uncle called it illness." Edmund said she had become confused. "These figures are not confusion. You have been here less than a week, and the numbers still agree." His gaze sharpened. "You entered a forbidden room, opened my mother's private papers, and now speak as though you understand this family." Charlotte closed the ledger carefully. "I understand theft. I understand fear. I understand what happens when a household is taught that silence is safer than truth. You presume too much. No, Your Grace. I have only read what was hidden. The words struck harder because they were spoken without accusation. Alexander looked at the ledger, then at Charlotte, as though the two had become inseparable threats. Why were you so eager to find this? I was not eager. I was responsible. Responsible to whom? To the people freezing in your cottages while false invoices are paid in their names. The room fell silent. Behind them, Thomas lowered his eyes. Alexander's grief hardened into pride before Charlotte could stop it. You will leave Ravenhurst at the end of 7 days. Thomas looked up. Your Grace, the decision is made. Charlotte did not plead. She did not ask him to reconsider. She only placed the Duchess's ledger on the desk and folded her hands before her. Then I will finish the wage accounts before I go. Alexander stared at her, perhaps expecting anger. Her calmness unsettled him more. You accept dismissal easily. I accept what cannot be changed by argument. And the ledger? It belongs to you. She turned toward the door. The truth does not. That night, Charlotte packed her case and returned every personal key except the household master ring, which she needed to complete the accounts. Near midnight, a soft sound came from the corridor. She opened her door and found no servant waiting there. Instead, dozens of keys lay in a line across the floor. Pantry keys, stable keys, linen keys, cellar keys, every department of Ravenhurst represented in silver and brass. At the far end stood Thomas Hale, his expression solemn. They asked me to tell you, he said, that if you are forced to leave, they will no longer keep this house's secrets. By sunrise, the corridor outside Charlotte's room had become a silent declaration. The keys remained where the servants had placed them, each one representing a door, a duty, and a truth kept too long beneath Ravenhurst's polished order. Charlotte gathered them carefully and carried them to the household office, where Thomas Hale waited beside the cold fireplace. They trust you, he said. They trust that I will listen. At Ravenhurst, that is nearly the same thing. One by one, the servants came forward. Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, produced kitchen accounts showing that food had been sold outside the estate while servants were blamed for shortages. James Porter from the stables brought invoices for horses that had never existed. The laundry mistress revealed letters in Edmund Clark's hand, instructing suppliers to divide false payments across several departments so no single theft appeared large enough to question. Charlotte arranged every page by date, amount, and witness. She did not accuse. She allowed the pattern to speak. Near noon, Thomas placed the old wage ledger before her and opened it to the column bearing his initials. Those payments were never mine, he said. 12 years ago, when His Grace was still young, Edmund altered the accounts and claimed I had approved them. The late Duchess discovered the discrepancy. Before she could present the full evidence, Edmund threatened to expose a mistake I had made while protecting Alexander from his uncle. Charlotte looked up. What mistake? Thomas's hands tightened around the edge of the desk. I signed a false travel record so the boy could be taken away from Ravenhurst for several weeks. His uncle had begun controlling his correspondence and isolating him from his mother. I believed distance would keep him safe. Edmund found the record and used it to bind my silence. You accepted blame to protect him, and by doing so, I helped Edmund remain. The confession carried no request for pardon. Charlotte closed the ledger. Then the truth must be complete, even where it harms the innocent. Thomas nodded slowly. That is why they chose you. Alexander entered before Charlotte could answer. His gaze moved across the stacked evidence and the servants standing behind her. No one bowed until Thomas did, and even then the gesture felt formal rather than fearful. What is this? Alexander asked. The household accounts, Charlotte replied. The ones Ravenhurst has been paying for 12 years. Edmund appeared in the doorway behind him, his composure strained. This is insubordination. No, Mrs. Webb said from the back of the room. This is testimony. Others followed. The stable master, the pantry keeper, 2 tenant representatives. Each placed documents on the table. Alexander listened without interruption as the structure of deception rose before him. When Thomas confessed his own part, Alexander's expression softened with something close to grief. You should have told me. You were taught not to believe servants, Thomas answered. Miss Bennet taught us we might still believe one another. Alexander looked toward Charlotte. She had not taken his chair. She stood beside the table in her plain blue dress, hands marked with ink, authority resting on her without title or permission. "You did not seize control," he said quietly. "No, they gave it to you. Because no one else would carry what they knew." Before he could respond, carriage wheels sounded beneath the front windows. A footman entered with a sealed envelope and a face drained of color. "Lady Victoria Caldwell has arrived, Your Grace." The great doors opened moments later. Victoria crossed the hall in a dark green traveling gown, followed by a solicitor carrying a leather case. Her smile was polished, her timing exact. "I fear I bring unfortunate news," she said. The solicitor laid a document on the table and broke the red seal. It accused Charlotte Bennet of falsifying estate records, stealing private correspondence, and causing the collapse of her former employer's household. The signatures appeared official. The seal appeared genuine. Victoria turned toward Alexander with practiced concern. "You have welcomed a fraud into Ravenhurst." Charlotte read the first page without changing expression. Then she reached the final line and saw the name beneath the seal. It belonged to a man who, according to her father's last letter, had been dead for nearly 2 years. Charlotte kept her eyes on the dead man's signature while the room waited for her to tremble. She did not. Lady Victoria's solicitor adjusted his spectacles and began reading the accusations aloud, each sentence polished to sound final. Charlotte had supposedly altered payroll records at Ashford House, stolen private letters, and vanished before creditors arrived. The document ordered her removal from any position of trust until a formal inquiry could be held. "You understand the seriousness of this," Victoria said to Alexander. "Ravenhurst cannot be placed in the hands of a woman pursued for fraud." Alexander looked at Charlotte, then at the seal. "Is the name familiar to you?" "Very," Charlotte replied. "Mr. Jonathan Pierce supervised the Ashford accounts. He died 22 months ago." The solicitor's confidence shifted. "That is impossible. My father attended his funeral." Charlotte folded the document and placed it back on the table. "The date beneath his signature is from last spring." A murmur moved through the servants. Victoria's expression remained composed. "A clerical error proves nothing. It proves someone expected no one to look closely." Charlotte turned to Alexander. "But this is not my decision. Your Grace must choose whether suspicion is enough." The words forced the room into a deeper silence. Alexander's gaze moved across the evidence surrounding her, the servants who had spoken because she made truth possible, and the legal paper designed to awaken every fear he carried. For one moment, Charlotte saw the old instinct return. Retreat behind rank, delayed judgment, trust the document because paper seemed safer than people. His hesitation lasted only seconds. It was still enough. Charlotte understood. "Thomas," she said quietly, "please bring my traveling case." Alexander's head lifted. "You are leaving?" "I was already dismissed. That order was given before this." "Before what?" she asked. "Before the house proved useful enough to defend me?" He had no answer ready. Charlotte removed the master key from her belt and placed it in Thomas Hale's hand. "The wage accounts are complete. The witness statements are arranged by department. The late Duchess's ledger is in the Eastern study." Victoria watched with satisfaction she tried not to show. A sensible decision. Charlotte turned toward her. "Do not mistake departure for surrender." The solicitor closed his case too quickly, and Thomas noticed. He reached across the table before the man could secure the clasp. A loose page slipped onto the floor. Thomas picked it up and stared at the embossed mark in the lower corner. This paper came from the Caldwell legal office. Victoria's face cooled. The solicitor reached for it. Thomas stepped back. "And the seal?" Charlotte asked. He held the document beneath the lamp. The wax carried the crest of Ashford House, but the impression was too clean, the edges unworn. "A copied matrix," Thomas said. "Made recently." Charlotte looked again at the signature. "There is another way to prove it." She opened her case and removed a letter wrapped in linen. "This was the final correspondence Mr. Pierce sent my father before his death." She placed both signatures side by side. The forged one leaned sharply to the right. The authentic hand remained nearly vertical. Even Alexander could see the difference. Victoria's solicitor began gathering his papers. "This meeting has become improper." "It became improper when you entered with a dead man's name," Alexander said. His voice carried through the room with quiet authority. The solicitor stopped. Alexander turned to Victoria. "You will remain at Ravenhurst until these documents are examined." You cannot detain me over household gossip. No, but I can refuse my carriage, my horses, and my protection. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time. Charlotte watched Alexander, waiting to hear what would come next. He faced her, but the apology in his eyes arrived before the words. I should have trusted you immediately. Yes. Her answer was simple. You should have. He accepted it. Stay until the inquiry. Charlotte took her cloak from the chair. No, several servants looked toward her in alarm. Ravenhurst does not need me to remain silent inside it, she continued. It needs you to decide whether truth matters when no one is strong enough to force you. Then she walked toward the front doors. Alexander did not command her to stop. Outside, morning frost silvered the steps, and Thomas followed carrying her case. Behind them, the house stood awake at last, every curtain open, every hidden account exposed. At the gate, Thomas paused and held out a small envelope. Inside was the original death notice of Jonathan Pierce, dated almost 2 years before the accusation had been signed. Where did this come from? Charlotte asked. The solicitor dropped it in the east corridor. She looked back toward Ravenhurst. In an upstairs window, Victoria's silhouette vanished behind the curtain. Charlotte understood then that the forged order was only the beginning. Someone inside the house had prepared for her arrival long before she ever crossed its threshold. The spring dinner was announced as a private gathering, but by sunset every influential family within 30 miles had arrived at Ravenhurst. Carriages lined the drive beneath budding elms, and the great hall glowed with hundreds of candles reflected in polished silver. Lady Victoria had chosen the evening carefully. The servants wore formal livery. The dining table stretched beneath the portraits of generations who had ruled by inheritance and silence. At its head sat Duke Alexander Reed, composed in black, while Victoria occupied the place to his right as though it had already been promised to her. Charlotte entered through the west doors in a plain dark blue gown, escorted by Thomas Hale. She had returned only because the forged order, the death notice, and the Duchess's ledger were to be examined before witnesses. Conversation faded as she crossed the room. Victoria smiled. How brave of you to appear. Truth requires less courage than deception, Charlotte replied. Edmund Clark stood near the sideboard, his expression smooth, though sweat shone at his temples despite the cool room. The solicitor who had carried the false order sat beside him. On the table before Alexander lay the copied seal, Jonathan Pierce's authentic letter, the late Duchess's ledger, and 12 years of household accounts. Victoria rose first. Before dinner begins, Ravenhurst deserves protection from the woman who has turned servant against master and rumor against law. She looked toward the household staff positioned along the walls. You have all forgotten your place. No one answered. Then Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, stepped away from the wall and moved her chair from the rear table. She turned it toward Charlotte. The stable master followed. Then the pantry keeper. Then the laundry mistress. One by one, every department head repositioned a chair to face Charlotte rather than Alexander. The scrape of wood across marble became the only sound in the room. Even the tenant representatives near the doors turned toward her. Alexander watched without anger. At last, he understood what the gesture meant. They were not rejecting his title. They were choosing the person they trusted to speak plainly. Charlotte placed her hands on the back of an empty chair. I did not ask them to do this. That is why they did, Thomas said. Victoria's smile vanished. A performance proves nothing. Then let the records speak. Charlotte opened the first ledger. She traced coal payments to a company registered under Edmund's cousin. She matched kitchen shortages to outside sales approved by his signature. She showed how unequal wages created resentment, how false invoices were divided among departments, and how letters to suppliers carried the Caldwell legal mark. The solicitor tried to object, but Thomas produced the death notice of Jonathan Pierce. Mrs. Webb presented the copied seal. The stable master laid down receipts for horses that had never entered Ravenhurst. Each document narrowed the room around Edmund and Victoria. You have no authority to question me, Edmund said. No, Charlotte replied. But the truth does. Alexander rose. His voice was quiet, yet every guest heard it. Miss Bennet was dismissed because I mistook discomfort for danger. I believe that anyone who exposed weakness threatened my house. In doing so, I protected the very people who weakened it. He faced Charlotte. I was wrong. She met his gaze without softening. Yes, Your Grace. A murmur passed through the guests, startled by her refusal to rescue him from his own admission. Alexander accepted it. Until this inquiry is complete, Miss Bennet will direct the household accounts and all department reports. Charlotte shook her head. Not alone. Explain. The servants must have access to their own wage records. Tenant representatives must review estate contracts. No steward should control information without oversight. Alexander looked at the chairs turned toward her. Agreed. Victoria stepped back from the table. You would hand Ravenhurst to a servant? No, Alexander said. I would stop confusing obedience with loyalty. Edmund moved suddenly toward the side door, carrying a narrow leather ledger beneath his coat. Thomas called his name, but Edmund was already gone. On the table, one empty space remained where the final land registry should have been. Charlotte looked toward the dark doorway. He has taken the only book that proves who truly owns the southern farms. Outside, carriage wheels thundered across the gravel. By the time the front doors opened, Edmund had disappeared into the spring night with the future of Ravenhurst hidden under his arm. Charlotte knew where Edmund would go before Alexander finished ordering the horses. The southern farms bordered the river, and beyond them stood an abandoned warehouse once used to store grain contracts and tenant records. If Edmund intended to destroy the final ledger, he would choose the one place where smoke, water, and darkness could erase 12 years of theft without witnesses. The old warehouse, she said. Alexander turned toward her. How certain are you? Certain enough to leave now. They traveled south beneath a moon hidden by clouds, the carriage wheels striking hard against the muddy road. Thomas remained at Ravenhurst to secure the accounts, while two local constables followed at a distance. Alexander sat opposite Charlotte in silence, his hands closed around the edge of the seat. You should not have to finish what my negligence allowed, he said at last. This is not about your guilt. No, it is about their land. She looked through the rain-streaked window toward the dark fields. If the ledger disappears, Edmund will claim the southern tenants signed away rights they never understood. Families could lose homes they have worked for generations. The carriage stopped half a mile from the river, where fallen branches blocked the road. Charlotte continued on foot with Alexander beside her. Lantern light moved across wet grass and bare trees until the warehouse appeared beyond the reeds, its broken roof outlined against the night. Several tenant men stood near the entrance. They were not servants of Edmund by loyalty. They were frightened farmers holding papers that carried debts large enough to ruin them. Edmund waited behind them with the narrow ledger under one arm. Come no closer, he called. Alexander stepped forward, but Charlotte placed a hand against his sleeve. Let me speak. She approached alone until the lantern revealed the faces of the men guarding the door. Mr. Carter, she said to the oldest among them, your contract claims you owe 3 years of unpaid rent. His eyes lowered. That is what the paper says. The grain records show you paid every season. Edmund laughed. Records she invented. Charlotte ignored him. Mr. Lewis, your wife received a notice that your cottage would be taken if you refused to sign Edmund's new agreement. Mrs. Webb found the original lease. It gives your family permanent tenancy as long as the fields remain cultivated. The men looked at one another. Edmund's confidence thinned. She cannot protect you. The Duke will punish every man involved. Alexander moved into the lantern light. No tenant will be punished for a debt created by fraud. His voice carried across the riverbank. Every false contract will be reviewed publicly. Charlotte continued. You were made afraid of one another because fear kept you silent. Give us the ledger, and your testimony will be treated as evidence, not betrayal. Mr. Carter slowly stepped away from the warehouse door. The others followed. No struggle came. No threat was needed. Edmund stood alone with the book pressed against his coat, surrounded not by enemies, but by people who had stopped believing him. Ravenhurst belongs to men like me, he said bitterly. Men who understand how power works. Charlotte met his gaze. Power that survives only in darkness is not power. It is dependence. Edmund looked toward the constables approaching along the path. At last, he placed the ledger on a wooden crate and stepped back. Alexander retrieved it, but handed it immediately to Charlotte. You should be the one to open it. Inside were the missing land deeds, forged mortgages, and records proving Ravenhurst stood close to financial collapse. By dawn, Edmund was taken into lawful custody, and every tenant returned home with written assurance that no family would be removed during the investigation. Back at Ravenhurst, Charlotte worked for 3 weeks without rest, rebuilding the estate plan from the recovered records. She proposed open-wage books, elected tenant representatives, independent audits, and shared authority over contracts. Alexander agreed to every condition, not because she demanded obedience, but because she had shown him that secrecy was the first servant of corruption. On the final morning of May, a letter arrived bearing the seal of Westbridge Manor, one of the largest estates in the region. Its trustees offered Charlotte full authority over their household and lands, with twice the salary Ravenhurst could afford. She read the letter beside the open east window while summer light entered the room. Alexander saw the decision forming in her face before she spoke. They want me to begin in June. He looked toward the restored gardens below, where servants now crossed the paths without lowering their voices. Will you go? Charlotte folded the letter carefully. I have not decided. Yet by evening, her traveling case stood open once more. By the first morning of June, Ravenhurst no longer resembled the house Charlotte had entered beneath the October rain. Every curtain stood open. Fresh air moved through the eastern corridor. Children from the tenant cottages read beneath the library windows, and the kitchen sent bread to the village before breakfast was served upstairs. Department heads gathered each morning in the household office with ledgers they were no longer forbidden to see. The new steward reported wages openly. Tenant representatives reviewed contracts beside the estate solicitor. And when decisions could not wait, every question found its way to Charlotte Bennet. She stood at the long oak table in a pale blue summer dress, listening as the stable master described repairs. Mrs. Webb requested funds for the schoolroom, and Thomas Hale presented the weekly accounts. No one obeyed her because they feared dismissal. They answered because her judgment had never required their silence. Yet her traveling case remained packed beside her bedroom door. The Westbridge carriage was expected before noon. Alexander knew this, though he had not mentioned it since the letter arrived. He watched from the gallery as Charlotte finished the morning meeting and returned each key to its proper hook. When the last servant departed, he entered carrying a leather portfolio sealed with the Ravenhurst crest. Westbridge will arrive within the hour, he said. Yes. You have not told me your decision. Charlotte closed the final ledger. You did not ask again. I was trying not to make your freedom another duty. The answer stopped her. Alexander placed the portfolio on the table. Inside was a signed charter granting Charlotte independent authority over household management, wages, tenant appeals, and estate audits. Her position could not be revoked without review by the tenant council and department heads. The salary matched Westbridge's offer. More importantly, the document remained valid whether she lived at Ravenhurst or managed its affairs from elsewhere. You are giving me power even if I leave, she said. It is not mine to give. You earned it before I understood what it was. Beyond the windows, summer light rested across the gardens where the last damaged walls had been cleared. Alexander's voice lowered. I once believed this house would break you. Instead, you taught every soul inside it to stand upright. Charlotte looked at the charter, then at the man who had first dismissed her as temporary and fragile. And what do you want in return? Nothing you are not free to refuse. He stepped back from the table. If you go to Westbridge, Ravenhurst will honor every term. If you remain, it will not be as my servant. The stillness between them held more weight than any proposal spoken before witnesses. Then in what place would I remain? Alexander did not reach for her. Beside me, if that is a place you choose. Above me, when your judgment is better. Away from me, when I have forgotten how to listen. A quiet laugh escaped her before she could prevent it, the first he had heard from her, without sorrow beneath it. Carriage wheels sounded along the drive. Thomas appeared in the doorway, but did not interrupt. Charlotte crossed to the window. Below, the Westbridge driver waited beside a polished carriage. Servants had gathered in the courtyard, not to persuade her, but to say farewell if farewell was what she chose. Mrs. Webb held the pantry key. The stable master held the yard key. Thomas carried the master ring. Every symbol once used to divide Ravenhurst now rested openly in trusted hands. Charlotte returned to the table and closed the portfolio. Send word to Westbridge that I decline. Alexander's breath caught. Because Ravenhurst needs you? No, she met his gaze. Because I no longer need Ravenhurst to need me. She extended her hand. I am staying because this house has finally learned how to become a home. Alexander took her hand with quiet reverence. Outside, The servants began opening the remaining windows of the eastern wing, and sunlight entered rooms that had waited 12 years to breathe. True authority is not inherited in silence. It is earned when frightened people finally trust someone enough to speak.